name is Marek Ziemak. I hope you can hear me well, right? I'm not sure about this. Okay, perfect. I'm a senior producer at 11-Bit Studios. I'll start with shortly introducing myself and then talking a bit about the subject of this presentation. Oops. More than perfect now. Okay. So, as I said, my name is Marek Ziemak. I'm a senior producer. I work in a part of 11-Bit Studio called 11-Bit Launchpad, which is a, indie publishing initiative platform. I'm focusing on producing indie projects that we're actually publishing as 11-Bit Studios, using our own experience, using our marketing and distribution knowledge that we already possess and we got after so many years of publishing our own titles. I started my game dev career around 7 years ago, I think, back when I was studying IT. I started as a game tester for The Witcher 1. Then I switched to gameplay scripting department where I worked for a few years on a bit of a Witcher 1, Witcher 2. I also had a chance to work as a level designer in the Witcher 2 project, and after this I changed my specialty to production. I started producing the gameplay department for The Witcher 3, and then at the very beginning of this year I switched to 11-Bit Studios, where, like I said, I'm taking care of 11-Bit Launchpad. Okay, so the topic of today's presentation is scheduling. It's going to be about scheduling and planning in overall. We won't go into too many details, as of course the scope of the presentation is somehow limited. I will want to focus on two, I think, most important, we can call those documents or events that will be game vision and game backlog. And I'll try to explain how we can approach creating these documents and where to start. I think all the information that I'll be talking about is useful not only for big AAA productions, but also, or even especially, for indie teams. Because although the budgets for indie smaller games are of course usually smaller, I think the pipelines are very similar. It's just a difference in the scale, but the approach, I think, should be somehow the same. Maybe it's a bit easier to organize your stuff in your smaller projects, so that's one benefit of being smaller for sure. Okay, let's start with defining planning. That's a kind of a cliche, but it's a good introduction into the presentation. So Wikipedia defines planning as a diagram or a list of steps with timings and resources used to achieve an objective. Now, this would be a very good definition of planning, of course, if we were thinking about manufacturing stuff, like producing cars. It won't do the job if we'd be thinking about producing the very first prototype or unique version of a car, but of course if our goal is to produce like 1,000, 2,000, 100,000 the same cars, then we can approach to planning and with this definition. We know what the needed resources are, we know exactly how much time we need to produce something, and then we can constantly achieve the same goal. I think for us the definition should be a bit different. I believe that in game development, planning is a process that is somehow, there with you since the very beginning of production of your game till the end. And it's a process delivering you constantly a refreshed answer to what are you doing, when are you doing it, and how basically are you trying to achieve it, okay? That's very important to understand that this is a process. This isn't a single task that's happening somewhere at the very beginning of the whole production process and is there with you till the end of pre-production. Okay, I think that planning has the possibility, or usually it affects not only the shape of your game, this is something important to understand, but also the way you plan your game will affect, of course, your budget, your dates, but I think it also affects the productivity of your team, your game vision, your team's creativity and their motivation. Because obviously, if you won't handle your planning well, then you probably have to introduce crunch. You'll be short on resources. You won't afford the plugins, for example, that you need to survive. And stress will be introduced into this project. And this will, again, decrease all the other factors like motivation, like your creativity, and so on and so on. I think the biggest problems caused by lack of planning are, like I said, lack of time during your development process, but also, well, it affects, for example, your communication with your future players, because nowadays it's very important to think since the very beginning also about your marketing plan and how you're trying to explain to your players what your game will be about. If you don't do this planning up front, if you don't really know what your game will be about in the early stages of your development, then it's going to be very hard for you to communicate or to explain to all your potential players what are you trying to achieve. Okay, planning the plan. So where should planning start? As I said, in manufacturing industries, usually we have this approach where planning is really taken care of at the very beginning. Everyone tries to create a very detailed schedule of what to be produced when, and they believe that once it's created, they can move to another stage of developing. So this would be production. This would be a clear waterfall approach. I think waterfall approach is not the very best one for game development. Why? Because plans get outdated. I think that game development is a kind of a struggle. It's like a war. It's war against technology limitations. It's war against your lack of creativity, against time. So there are many different factors that are actually constantly affecting what you are doing and how are you doing it. And because I perceive game development a bit as a war, I think that many quotations created by military leaders are very useful to define what planning is and when we should start planning. This is one of my favorite ones, for example. So plans are nothing, but planning is everything. This already tells you a lot about the whole process of planning and how useful plans are. This highlights the problem or the need of constantly updating your plan once you're creating it. Another good one is no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. Now I'm sure you know this one by heart. Whenever you're trying to create something really creative, you plan your approach, you plan your steps, but then as you start to pursue your vision, things start to change. It's also worth understanding that once you're trying to create a perfect plan, well, it's probably not going to happen, because you always have some time limitations and you always face the unknown, because you're trying to create this project which is somehow unique. You're not really 100% sure what steps you should take in order to achieve your final goal. This is why it's worth remembering that a good plan that's executed now is better than a perfect plan next week. This means that you shouldn't really focus too much on delivering the best plan with all the small details inside of it. It's often a good enough plan is just what you need at the current stage of development. Okay, well, this was a kind of a big introduction. Now I think I'll go into something a bit more interesting even. Where planning starts. I think that planning of your game process or game development process should start at the very beginning of you thinking about your game vision, for example. So I think once your game vision is somehow created, you have it in your mind, I don't know, you're thinking about making, let's say, a racing game. Let's say you're making a racing game for a mature audience. This is your very basic shape of your idea. Now, right here, you should already start slowly defining it. Before, of course, moving to implementation, you might start prototyping a bit and so on. But you should start creating your vision document and try to answer all of the questions regarding your game, like what the game will be about and so on and so on. I think also that this very beginning is a perfect moment to start choosing your strategy of entering your market and how you will approach your players. I think there are two basic strategies. This is a frontal attack and backstabbing. Now, why am I saying this or talking about this at the very early stage of, or why do I think this is very important at the early stage of development? Because I think that choosing your strategy in advance will help you to create a game which shape is fully supporting your vision and which basically allows your your game to achieve its full potential. Now, these two strategies, I think, are significantly different. The frontal attack strategy is about creating a game that basically, it jumps straight into a well-defined genre like the racing games, FPS, and trying to find its place there, trying to overwhelm its competition somehow. So it's trying to be better, let's say, in terms of graphics, in terms of well-defined gameplay, physics engine, and so on and so on. The frontal attack strategy is something, it's like saying, well, I want to make a project similar to a different game, but somehow better. Then you have to focus on those small innovations, and you have to focus on really polishing all the features that are delivered in a very good way in other products, where backstabbing is another type of a strategy. This strategy is focusing on creating a totally unique product, where you're trying to create your own niche. I think that many indie games are trying to do this at this very moment on the market. So they're not, I think Papers, Please might be a very good example. Look at these games. They're somehow hard to define. They're very cool to play, but it's not that you can easily define the genre of this game or easily compare it to anything other on the market. So I think these are the two strategies that are somehow dominating right now. And you should choose your approach somewhere in advance, because it will affect your features and it will affect the shape of your game later on in the production process. Now, which one is better? I think there's no simple answer to this, because, of course, you can see the huge popularity of, let's say, Call of Duty and Battlefield games. Of course, these are taking the first approach. These are the games that are using the frontal attack. This is a well-defined genre. You know what features you must deliver. You know what quality you must deliver in order to make your players, your audience, see your game. On the other hand, backstabbing, like I said, is used more often by smaller indie projects. Now, I think also frontal attack is something that's being preferred by programmers and many artists. Usually, programmers are trying to deliver technology that is somehow better. It's just, pushing the limits, especially in the AAA part of the industry. So they're trying to compete with other developers. They're trying to deliver graphics that's just nicer and more realistic than in the other products. Whereas designers usually pursue to fulfill their creative vision and create something redefining totally the whole industry, and they usually like to focus on the backstabbing technique. So, okay, I think that at the very early stage of your development, you should already start thinking about your strategy. What type of game are you trying to do? Something absolutely unique, or something that will be defined or be compared to other games already on the market? I think this is a very important decision. Now, there's a tool that might help you to approach this problem, might help you to define the final shape of your game. This is a tool called the Kano model. It was created by a professor, Noriaki Kano, in the 80s. And it's a model basically of product development and customer satisfaction. But I think it might be used in game development with a lot of successes, I think. So it basically defines 5 different types of features. These are basic features: performance, excitement, indifferent, and reverse. And I think it's really worth thinking about what features your game will have, what features it should have, and how will this affect, well, the communication of your game? How will this affect the satisfaction of your players? The basic features, you can see a graph back, it's back there. Now I'll try to explain how these types of features work, basic features are the ones that are taken for granted by your audience. So they basically do not bring extra satisfaction to your players if they're delivered. But once they're not delivered in your game, people will become totally raging. For example, save game system. Usually game allow you to save your progress. And you don't get excited about a game because you have a save game system inside of it. But if you don't deliver such a system, people will usually really be well, they won't be too happy with your game unless it is a game about not saving your progress. So it's really worth thinking about all the basic features. Now, how to define a list of the basic features that your game must deliver? A good enough example is comparing or checking out all the other products available on the market, right? So there's a series of basic features that all games deliver at this moment, and your game should be delivering them as well. Now, it's also worth remembering that people usually don't get excited about these features. They just expect them to be there and work somehow. So these aren't the types of features you should invest too much of your time and resources in development. You shouldn't probably do something absolutely extra regarding saving your games. I don't know, spend too much time on decreasing the size if you don't have to, because it will not be appreciated by your audience. This is also a perfect example of the features that might be outsourced or bought. For example, I think that Unity nowadays is delivering a lot of basic features. These are the features that are working, that are good enough for your players. Now, wherever you expect something more from the game, of course, you have to deliver it by your own, with your own team. But all the basics are there. So this is the group of features that can be bought or outsourced. Now, another group of features are the performance ones. Now, these are a bit more interesting. Why? Because performance features are the ones that your audience really sees. And as you can see on the chart back there, the more or the better the performance features are in your game, the more excited your audience will be. But the less you deliver these, they will see that it lacks of this performance aspect in your game, and your audience will be dissatisfied. Now, just to give you an example of this type of features, for example, price of the game. This is a simple one, but you can see that the better the price, this means the lower the price, the more excited your audience will be. The higher the price, the less excited they will be. The quality of art style. This is another performance features. Look what's happening in the AAA segment right now. Every game is trying, or most of the games are trying to redefine somehow the visual quality, the visual potential, what's happening on the screen. This is where the real battle is happening. The length of gameplay. This is another example of a performance feature. So the performance features are the group of features that are really compared. So once you jump into the market, people will try to think of what your performance features are and compare them right away to other games on the market. So you as a designer, you as a producer, as a person responsible for the game vision, should also think of what your performance features will be and where do you want to deliver something more than your competitors, where it's just good enough to be somewhere in the middle of the chart, okay? Now, the third type of features are the excitement ones. I think these are the most important or most interesting ones, because these are the ones that your audience is absolutely not expecting. This is something extra you deliver with your games. Because whenever you approach a person on the street and you ask them about what your favorite game would be about, what it should be like, people will start usually telling you about performance features. Well, it should cost this much, and it should have superb graphics, and it should allow you to jump into every vehicle and kill everyone on the street. This is constantly the performance area. So it's more better of the well-defined stuff. Now, excitement features, these are the things that you deliver and that somehow take your audience by surprise. Again, I think Papers, Please are a perfect example, because they created this unique flavor, taste, and this unique setting, which basically surprises you once you launch the game. Now, the excitement features have the strongest potential of affecting your players, affecting your audience. So once you deliver excitement features, they start thinking more and more about your game, and they think about buying it. So already at this stage, I think you should be aware that you can shape the strategy for your game in many different ways. You can, for example, you have to deliver the basic features almost always, but you can focus on the performance features and try to deliver as many in as good quality as possible, or you can try to move the battlefield from the performance features to delivering some more of the excitement features and basically taking your players by surprise and redefining whatever you're trying to create. There are also two other last types of features that you should also be aware of. These are the indifferent features. That's basically, those are the elements of your game that players absolutely do not take care of. For example, the naming conventions of your files or something like this. There are elements of your games of this type, and you should be aware of that and not spend too much resources developing it, because it absolutely makes no sense. And there are also reverse features. Now, this is something else that's worth remembering. These are the features that satisfy a group of your or a set of people in your audience, but they dissatisfy other people. I think if you be, for example, introducing, let's say, long dialogues in an action FPS game, then this might increase the satisfaction of RPG fans, for example, but of course it will probably decrease the satisfaction of the FPS and really action game fans. So this is something to be aware of. Okay, so I think this, just to sum up, this model can be used. I know it's quite rushed. It sounds very technical. I know we're all in a very creative industry, but I think it's really worth thinking about those different types of features as you're trying to create your game vision and your game design document, because it will really improve or make it easier for you to talk about your game later on and compete on the market with different products. Okay, this is just an example of how different features might be assigned to different groups. For example, the physics engine, sound effects engine, and grass texture. This is another example. These are all probably basic features because, well, in most of the games, once players see them, they don't really care about them too much. They don't want to expect bugs. They don't want to see bugs, but they don't really spend too much time thinking about how great those features are. Now, performance features, renderer, the level of detail of your 3D world, number of quests. Now look, these are the things that are basically highlighted in almost all of the reviews. People keep on talking about them. So once you're defining your game, you want to satisfy those needs of your players in this group probably, because that's where your game will be compared. And now there's the excitement group. This might be setting. For example, of course, if you're just creating any game, your setting or your storyline can be a performance or even a basic feature if it's just somewhere in the background. But if you deliver something truly unique, this might become the excitement, something that will make people buy your game just only because you deliver this wow factor, that the setting is so interesting that they will not be looking at the performance features. They will not be comparing your game regarding other elements. Actually, the funny story back there, I'm sorry, I just moved the slide. The funny story back there is that I think during the development of The Witcher 1, we didn't, it was the early stage of Witcher 2. We didn't define all the basic features, and quite late in the production, we found out that we forgot about saving games. This was one of the examples. This is something absolutely easy to forget about, because as a creative person, of course, you try to pursue all those super excitement features, and you usually do not define those obvious ones in your plan. Okay, now another model or another pipeline that you might be using to define the vision of your game, to help you shape your game, is the Swot Analysis. Now, I know this is another cliche. This is something you probably be learning about in all the business schools and business majors at maybe the first year. But I think this model can really, or you can really benefit from using this model also while creating games, even if these are indie productions. Now, SWOT model is something that, well, forces you to define 4 different factors or 4 different elements of your environment and of your team, your strengths and weaknesses and opportunities and threats. Now that's what the SWOT model basically looks like. And it encourages you to answer a few simple questions. What are my strengths? I believe it's really good to answer these questions before you move into development of your selected, let's say, game vision. because it can help you on as you progress through the development cycle and so on and so on. So you have to answer the questions, what are my strengths? As a team, as a company, as the organization I work with. This might be, for example, your internal technology. This might be the experience of your programmers. I don't know, having a perfect concept artist. These are all the strengths of your team that you might use to create even a better game. This creates positive value for you. Now, you also should think before approaching a game development cycle, what are my weaknesses? For example, I have absolutely no GUI artists and no one to take care about GUI. Now, this probably should make you think about what kind of a game you're creating. Does it need a very intense UI? How will you be communicating some stuff to the players? And possibly you might want to avoid some solutions, some features in your game because there's no one to implement it later on. So if you know that this is your weakness, just try to avoid it right away at the very beginning. Now, another two things to think about, these are more related to your external environment, are opportunities. Are there right now on the market some opportunities that I can really use or benefit from? For example, new platforms are being delivered. Or maybe I have access to these platforms and other people don't. Maybe I can use this to benefit my company, to benefit my whole production cycle or my game. Or maybe are there threats happening around me? I think a good example of a threat might be a threat that comes from an environment, a new studio opening just around the corner, and there's a huge possibility that half of your developers will leave your company and go back there because, I don't know, they pay better money. See, this is something, okay, this is a kind of a business characteristics, but still it can greatly affect your game and what you achieve at the end of the production cycle. So before jumping into production, I think it's really worth analyzing all of these factors and trying to create a vision of your game that will be supporting all of the strengths and will be avoiding your weaknesses and so on and so on. Okay, another slide is called Know Your Limits, because once you really check your environment, once you shape your vision and have a bit more details about what you're trying to create, you think you know what your performance features will be, you think you know what your excitement features will be, you have to be aware that, of course, your project is somehow limited. And there are 4 different characteristics. This is, again, very obvious, but we very often forget about this. There are 4 different characteristics that are connected to each other. These are resources, time, scope, and quality. They basically create this thing called iron triangle, magic triangle. There are different names to this. As you can see, or what you should see, is that moving a single element of this triangle affects you to change other 2 or 3 elements as well. So the bigger the scope of your game is, the more time and resources usually you, of course, need to develop it. Again, if you're cutting resources, if you're cutting time, if you're cutting the amount of money you have in your project, this will force you to decrease your scope as well. This is something we very often forget about. This is something, easily, I think, overseen in the production of games. Sometimes we create this massive scope without even thinking how much cash and how much time it will take to develop, and then we're unprepared for cutting our features, and the games end up unfinished, buggy, and so on. Because what happens if you decrease your scope without increasing your time and resources, it then affects your quality. It all has to be balanced somehow. It's very, very important to remember about keeping this balance. Now, as games keep on growing and people start on delivering more and more performance features, the budgets of the game, of course, keep on increasing. I just had a few fun facts for this, that, for example, Heavenly Sword in 2010 sold in 1,500,000 copies, and it almost did not break even. The studio almost failed. Imagine how huge of a number this is. Now, they decided to create this massive game. They decided to deliver a lot of I think performance features, that what the game was mostly about, delivering cool art and quite good animations and so on and so on. Of course, this increased their scope, this increased their time and budget, and at the end they had to sell so many copies of the game that it was just simply very difficult for them, especially at the very beginning of the platform wasn't so popular back at this time. So every time you shape your game, you have to think also about how much it's going to cost to develop it and how much copies you will have to sell in order to get the money back, because this is business at the end of the day after all. Okay, so we are at the vision document. So after you did all this thinking, modeling, after you defined what you think are your performance features, what you think are your excitement features, you know what your opportunities and threats are, what are your strengths and weaknesses, I think the first really important document you should be creating is your vision document. And vision document, we're actually at 11-bit Studios using a format created by Maciek Szcześnik. It's a bit expanded by me as well. But I think it's a very, well, I would encourage everyone to keep on using this format because it highlights some very important elements of your game and it forces you to define them as you create this document. First of all is a premise. Premise is a simple one-sentence explanation of what your game is. It's also trying to have all the USPs inside of it. So imagine you only have one sentence to make your players buy the game. What would you tell them? This is very important to define even at the very beginning of the production cycle, because this usually, well, shapes everything else. This affects whatever you will be doing inside of your game. Now, another element that's worth defining at the very beginning is the universe. Again, this should be a very short description, but what universe, what kind of a setting you will be using for your game, because this again will affect all the later on details. Storyline. What's the story behind your game? What kind of characters you will be introducing? Who your character will be. Again, a very short description, but it's worth thinking about at an early stage of development. Core gameplay. What is your core gameplay? Let's say give 3-4 examples. Why the game is fun? What kind of mechanics you will be using there? Is there anything more about it? What are the secondary gameplay elements? If it's somehow really intense, maybe there's another mechanics that will be fun for a niche of players or other group of players. Try to define those at the very beginning as well. What's the goal of your game? Are you sure that your game really has a goal? Is there something that your players are trying to achieve? What's their goal once they start playing? And what is the challenge? What are the obstacles on their way of reaching the goal? What kind of mechanisms you're using to stand in the way of your players and to make them, want to overcome them, and so on and so on. Now, once they overcome these obstacles, what will be the reward of your players? Are you sure that your game is really rewarding your players? Are they getting all the fun after overcoming some challenge? Is it really satisfying for them? Now, it's also worth thinking about your target audience since the very beginning. What I mean by target audience are, well, of course, people who will be playing your game, but also the platforms you're trying to develop your game for. Because again, choosing the platform will probably affect the type of the game you might want to be creating, because people or the audience is different in different parts of the market. Gameplay examples. It's worth giving a good gameplay example for, like, let's say, imagine this is like explaining 60 seconds of your game. You choose whatever the perfect 60 seconds from your game are in your head, and you try to write it down in the form of a half page of a document. So for example, I start here and there, here, I do this and that, I kill a monster, I don't know, I start developing my character, and so on and so on. This is also something cool to have at the very early stage of creating your documentation and creating your game. Of course, you shouldn't forget about monetization, because depending on that, you will be delivering different types of features inside of your game. If you decide to create a premium game, obviously, well, you probably want to deliver as many performance and excitement features and then somehow talk about your game. And once people buy it, You just want them to be excited. But if you're deciding to create a free-to-play game, of course, you know this totally affects your game design. So it's worth defining this at the very early beginning. Okay, fulfill desires of your users. This is another element that's worth thinking about. What kind of a desire is my game fulfilling? Because think of it, players are buying games to fulfill some desires. Some want to explore a great world in your setting. Some want another challenge. What kind of desire are you fulfilling? And why should it be fulfilled with your game, not with some other product that's back there on the market? Is there anything unique about your game? It's worth defining at least 5 unique features of your product. Think, why would people want to play your game? What's different about it? What's really unique? These will be the elements you will be using later on for also shaping and creating your marketing plan and your marketing communication. And finally, how are all of those above features unique? So it's not just enough to define them or saying that, well, my art style is unique. Okay, but already in the vision document, try to explain why is it unique? Who believes it's unique? Because sometimes people say, well, this and this and this element of my game is unique. Sure, because they've never played these kind of things in 100 other games that are back there on the market. So try to do your research and try to really explain why these features are unique, to whom they are unique, because this is very important. Okay, so this is basically the vision document. You should be creating, I think, somewhere around the end of pre-production or in the middle of pre-production. I believe that you should have a solid vision document definitely before you move on to producing your game, because the things you discover at this stage, the things you discover once you're defining the vision document and working all the other models I defined previously, will of course be greatly affecting the shape of your game. And you don't want to be changing your vision in the middle of your development process because it's simply very expensive. So I think vision is something that should be nailed at the very beginning or as soon as possible. Sometimes it takes many prototypes, sometimes it takes even partially creating the game design document, technical documentation, but I think moving to production is only safe once you have your vision quite locked. This should be a document that will become your guideline for the whole rest of your production cycle. This is something that's very important to define as early as possible. So once you have your vision document, once you think you know what kind of game you're doing, what kind of desires you will be fulfilling, I think you can move on to creating your backlog. Now your backlog is quite of a simple document. I'm sure many of you know what a backlog is. Many of you are using Agile. This is just one of the slides. I wanted to explain that I think it's really worth using Agile methodologies and planning your game in the form of a backlog, which is somehow a simplified schedule. I usually do not use project planning wherever I can because, as I said, I believe plans constantly change. I believe plans evolve, and I think the best way to plan right now is using some Agile methodology like Scrum, for example. So after you define your vision document, you should start creating your game design documents, your technical documents, defining the tasks, defining user stories, and then trying to define the priority of those and execute them. Execute them probably in this order. So try to always in advance deliver features that deliver high value but require low effort, then high value and quite high effort, and then move to the low priority features. Because I think usually in most games, the risk factor is on the level of about 50 to 30%. So it's worth remembering to taking care of the most important elements at the very beginning. Now also how to define what the most important elements for my game would be. Well, once you have your vision locked, once you know what kind of a game you're trying to deliver, what kind of what genre will it have, you can define a basic set of groups of features, for example. This is a very simplified example. Let's say you're creating an online RPG game. You know you have combat features, you know you should have probably character development, storyline, variety of characters, variety of environments. Now, you should try to make a decision somehow early in your production process. What's your target quality of these features? Now, should it be minimum, low, somehow average, or should it be superb? Of course, the bigger the quality of these groups of features, the more resources you have to spend to develop those. Again, if you remember about your magical triangle and that your resources are really limited, you have to choose wisely because you can't maximize everything. So somehow you have to choose where to spend the most resources and where just to deliver the minimum value because it's not really required by your players. Once you have the target quality of those features groups, you can start iterating on your game and checking if you reached the target quality after each iteration of your production process. So you start probably with none in current quality because you have nothing at the very beginning of your production cycle. But once you start delivering features from those groups, the quality will start growing. I think you should always focus on, first of all, delivering the basics from all of the major groups that you define. And then you should focus on delivering features from the groups where the gap is the biggest. For example, I don't know, you have your current quality set to minimum at all of these groups. So then I think you should start iterating in advance or with a priority one on character development features, variety of items, and multiplayer, because that's where the disproportion is the biggest. You're trying to achieve something superb, but then currently you have something that's just minimum. So you start focusing on this and then jump to the other target qualities. That's the last thing about the backlog. What I also wanted to explain is that once you have the feature categories nailed, you might want to assign these feature categories, obviously, to all of your main features. So let's say there's a user story. As a player, I would like to have a possibility to use bows. Sorry for this mistake back there, obviously. This is a combat feature, right? So this, once you implement it, this will improve the combat features group. Now, you might want to try to define how it will affect this group. And you might want to create your own measurement of this. What we propose is a very simple measurement where you define the importance of the feature, usability, and fan factor. And the average of these gives you a total value of the feature. And you know that once you develop this feature, the quality of your combat features will increase. So once you move to your development process or to your production part of the development process, you might want to start with developing the features that have the biggest value and the lowest effort to develop. And that's how you plan your production process. So basically later on, once you have your backlog defined, it should be quite simple. You have to define your backlog, then just develop the correct features, refresh your backlog, test your game, and so on and so on. I think that's how your production process should look like later on. Okay, well, that was a lot of talking. I'm sorry. I know that this was a huge amount of information, and I probably didn't have as much time as I would like to explain all of these basic concepts. But you can find a lot of extra information about these elements on the web and books about production and so on and so on. What I really wanted to achieve is to highlight that there are some models taken from, let's say, other industries and so on, that you can really be using in your game development process to help you define the shape of your game, to help you define the vision of your game, and that there are many elements that you should be thinking about in advance before developing your game, because that might simply increase the sales numbers of your game and the Metacritic score, the satisfaction of your players. And after all, this is something that's important, I think, to all of us, because all of us are trying to, or maybe most of us are trying to earn some money on developing games as well, because money allows you to keep on working on the games, to make them bigger, better, to have your team, to hire extra people, and so on. Okay, this is all. Thank you. If you would like to contact me, here's my email address. As I said, I work at 11-Bit Launchpad, which is a part of 11-Bit Studios. There's our website address. Thank you. If you have any questions, I think we have like a minute or two just to answer those. But I'm not sure if you do have any. Okay,
Yep.
thank you.